Hey everyone, welcome back. In my last video, a whole bunch of you left me comments asking me to go a little bit more in depth as to why the Republican Party doesn't really care about fiscal responsibility. So to show you guys what I mean, we're going to go through the entire history of the modern Republican Party, starting in 2010 with the Tea Party movement and going through to the present day. And what we're going to find is that while the Republican Party likes to talk about fiscal responsibility and reducing the deficit and the debt, when they actually get power, they don't quite follow through on their promises. Now, prior to 2010, the Republican Party, or at least the mainstream portion of the party, didn't really care about the debt or the deficit. George W. Bush campaigned on tax cuts that were not going to be paired with matching spending cuts. And when they would talk about shrinking the size of government, they didn't actually mean reducing government spending. They were instead talking about privatization. And this essentially was the government outsourcing its responsibilities to for-profit companies. So, essentially, instead of paying for the services directly, they would just pay these for-profit companies to do it. So it didn't really save the taxpayers any money, and there were some arguments put out that this would actually degrade the services provided to the citizens. But that's a story for another video. However, in 2010, things changed with the rise of the Tea Party movement. This group of newcomers to the political scene were hardline conservatives that were very interested in fiscal responsibility. We also saw some of the seeds of what would grow into the modern-day culture wars, but they were a little bit more fractured on what exactly they should be doing on the more traditional conservative values. But reducing the deficit and the debt, that was important to them. And the reason they were so hot up on this issue was that there had been a lot of government spending recently. The Obama administration had to deal with the 2008 financial crisis, and they also passed some very large pieces of legislation, including the Affordable Care Act, that did increase the deficit quite a bit. And this was a very popular argument against the administration, and it fared very well in the 2010 midterms, with a lot of people with no prior political history coming to power, defeating establishment Republicans in primaries, and then going on to win the general election. And this gave Republicans control of the House through the rest of the Obama administration. However, at no point were they actually able to regain control of all the levers of power or gain a supermajority in Congress to override Obama's veto. So, at the end of the day, there was only so much that the Republican Party could do. These Tea Party members would eventually coalesce into what today is the Freedom Caucus, and they would become an influential part of the Republican Party, driving out not one but two speakers of the House, and given how the current negotiations are going, maybe they'll even get a third. However, that all changed in the 2016 election, where Donald Trump became president, and Republicans were able to gain control of both the House and the Senate. Now, when it comes to some of their more culturally focused policies, they obviously were blocked by the filibuster in the Senate, as they didn't have a 60-vote majority in the Senate. However, when it comes to fiscal responsibility, there is a process called reconciliation, where budget bills can be passed through the Senate without a filibuster, as long as they are at least deficit neutral. So, if Republicans wanted to cut the deficit, cut spending, they could have done it, and there was nothing that the Democrats could have done to stop them. But that's not what they did. Instead, they passed a massive series of tax cuts, which further increased the deficit. Now, they also did this through reconciliation, and you might be asking, well, if it increased the deficit, how did they pass it that way? Well, you have to read into the text of the bill. Now, when it comes to deciding whether a bill is eligible for reconciliation, it just goes off the Congressional Budget Office's score. And when you look at the bill that the Republicans passed, not all of the tax cuts were permanent. The tax cuts for corporations were, but the tax cuts for individuals would only last for 5 years. And given that I believe it was a 10-year range that the deficit bill had to be calculated for, the CBO said over 10 years, if the individual tax cuts are allowed to expire, it would be deficit neutral. But, of course, Republicans weren't going to suddenly 5 years later raise people's taxes if Trump was still in office, and Democrats really couldn't do that either without playing into a really obvious Republican talking point. So those tax cuts were essentially permanent as well. And so, yeah, Republicans managed to blow a massive hole in the deficit. And they didn't really care. They also tried to appropriate money for the border wall. They ended up borrowing that from military housing and other installation projects to fund what little they did. And overall, we didn't really see them ever talking about actually cutting the deficit. Over the course of the Trump administration, they raised the debt ceiling 3 times without any real complaints. But in the wake of the 2020 election, Democrats were able to regain control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and Republicans suddenly remembered that, oh yes, we do care about the debt, the deficit, and the whole fiscal responsibility bit. And they trotted that message out in the 2022 midterms, and it met with mixed success. Honestly, they had a whole lot of other issues during that election cycle that caused them to underperform, but even that message of fiscal responsibility started to ring a little hollow with some voters who said, well, you had power for 2 years where you could have done whatever you wanted and you didn't do anything to fix the debt or the deficit, so we're not really buying this argument from you anymore. And Republicans ended up with only a small majority in the House, and the Democrats were able to keep control of the Senate, which leads us to where we are currently with the debt ceiling crisis we're facing now. The one thing that has been abundantly clear over the course of these negotiations is that the Republican House Conference has no idea how it wants to even approach the concept of fiscal responsibility. The bill that they ended up finally passing proposes some pretty significant cuts across the board, but at the end of the day, nobody was really comfortable with that bill. Moderates were saying that this cuts into too many things like border security, farm subsidies, defense spending, veteran spending that our voters will punish us for if we actually pass these cuts. Meanwhile, you have the Freedom Caucus saying that our voters will punish us if we don't cut even deeper, because we promised them there was all this wasteful spending that we never bothered to identify, and they expect it to be cut. And right now, they really don't have a path forward that they can all agree on. And it's starting to look very much like when this happened in 2011. The House Republican Conference back then was also pretty fractured, not nearly as much as it is now, but still it wasn't really able to coalesce around anything, and then ended up cutting a pretty toothless deal with the Obama administration. However, back then, Speaker John Boehner had a lot more power and influence. Meanwhile, Kevin McCarthy today, not so much. So that's really impacted the Republicans' ability to actually negotiate and find something to agree upon. So, yeah, they really don't know how they want to be fiscally responsible if they actually made cuts, and I don't think it's a stretch to say that if they actually force a default, that would be very fiscally irresponsible. So, as we've seen from the history of the modern Republican Party, they like to talk about fiscal responsibility, but their actions don't tend to support the claim that they actually care about it. When they had power in 2017 and 2018, they chose to instead increase the deficit through some fairly large tax cuts, and when there was a Democratic administration in control, they took the U.S.'s full faith and credit hostage not once, but twice, and in both scenarios, they didn't really have a solid plan that they could all get behind as to what needed to be cut and how we might get closer to that balanced budget they like to reference. It's almost like supporting fiscal responsibility is a talking point that polls really well, rather than a set of policies Republicans are actually interested in implementing. Think about it.